We all know that aim cone has to be one of the worst things to have ever come to Rust. But how bad is it really? Well, today, I'm going to be categorizing each ranged weapon so we can find out how bad each of Rust's guns really are. And before I get into it, I want to address some of the notes I can already see people leaving for Toasty and I.
Oh, but who are you to be giving advice? I don't know who you are.
Hi, I'm Sorbet. I'm a 3K hour legacy Rust player with 1500 hours in modern Rust for a total of almost 5K hours at the making of this list. I've separated this list into 4 use cases: weapons that are good for raiding and counter raiding, weapons that are good for PvP, weapons that are good for PvE, and weapons that you might as well scrap for parts because the only thing you'll be using them for is killing chickens. This is also not my personal opinion. These are facts. These are objective measures of reality just as much as the sky is blue. Trust me, I'm a scientist. Some of you might be wondering why I didn't just make a tier list. The simple answer is that most weapons in Rust have multiple uses, and generalizing a weapon may discount or overestimate the usefulness of that weapon. So some of these weapons will be put into multiple categories because they have multiple use cases. Let's start with the bread and butter of every wipe. The one tool/weapon that separates those who are going to get ahead in the early wipe and those who will not. The hunting bow. The hunting bow is really good in the early wipe. As I said, anyone who has a bow is going to likely be able to set up their base before anybody else. The bow dominates anyone who doesn't have a ranged weapon in the very early game. Those people with spears, bone knives, and stone tools simply will just not have enough firepower to keep up with anyone around them who has a bow. In the mid-wipe, however, and I would even say in the early mid-wipe, the bow falls off drastically, mostly due to the fact that some players will have nail guns, revolvers, and sometimes double-barrel shotguns and custom SMGs. The bow falls off so hard in the mid-wipe, and not for the reason you might expect. The bow is a single-shot weapon that, until you reload it with another arrow, doesn't fire off another projectile in a fast enough rate to keep up with the multiple players that you're going to run into in the early to mid-game. Also, in the mid-game, that's when big groups like Zergs, clans, 5-mans will have guns like Tommies and SARs. So around this time, the hunting bow easily gets wiped out by anyone carrying these weapons. However, in the late game, in the late wipe, a lot of players are only running around with tier 1 weapons. A lot of this doesn't have to do with just how the game is played, but also how a lot of servers are being run today. You might have noticed that servers are artificially changing their player count by either increasing or decreasing the overall player cap to match the amount of players that are currently on the servers. This means that more nakeds, more new players will be joining that server, and a lot of the time into the late game, you can still find players who are naked even 5 days into a 1-week wipe cycle. And these players will also have tier 1 weapons and bows. The use case of the hunting bow is pretty simple. In the early game, it's good for PvP, and if you're running in a big group, you could theoretically say that these could be used for PvE. However, the main monuments you're going to be running them at are Oxum's gas station or places like abandoned supermarkets. So we'll put the bow as a good weapon for PvP and PvE. To describe these categories a little more, raiding and counter raiding is pretty simple. For PvP, this can mean anything from going out and roaming or doing things like fetching airdrops. It could also mean pushing players who are in your area out of your general vicinity. PvE can include anything that has to do with monuments, whether that be Oxum's gas station or tier 3 monuments with scientists like military tunnels. It can also include attack helis, cargo ships, and oil rigs. You might notice that on the very right side, we have the recycling tier. This category is for any weapon that I deem to either not have any one particular category that it fits into, or have a counterpart that does what it's trying to do better. Now, that doesn't mean I'm trying to look for the best weapon in each category, but any weapon that particularly has a large gap between its use case and its cost to acquire, whether that be buying it from the outpost with scrap or crafting it with components, any gun that ends up in the recycling tier is probably not worth its use case for its cost. Alright, the Ioka. The Ioka used to kind of be a niche situation kind of weapon. If you had an Ioka and you had nothing else, or if you were trying to be really sneaky, The Ioka was one of those weapons that if you just whipped it out at the right time, it could potentially swing a situation in your favor. And that's usually how you use the Ioka. But with the changes to the recoil patterns, the Ioka, and I will even say generally as we go throughout this list, that shotguns have actually moved up in terms of usefulness. In the early game, yeah, the Ioka is pretty good. You know, you're running around with a bow, somebody charges you with a spear, and you need to get somebody that's really up close. The Ioka is one of those weapons that you can kind of just rely on early game and not really have to worry about losing. In the mid game, it's still pretty good, but in the very, very, very late game, if you're naked, if you're one of those people like I mentioned before, if you're one of the nakeds that are joining way late into a wipe, the Ioka can be your best friend, especially if you know how to use it right. You can go from naked to full road sign gear with one Ioka. And that's pretty big. Also, considering that most people aren't using tier 2 and tier 3 weapons the way they used to use before the recoil update, the Ioka is even slightly more viable as a sidearm weapon. Just load that thing up with a slug and pray to God that shell comes out with big damage. Now obviously, the Ioka as a tool is good for raiding, but as a weapon, I can't say that it's useful for pushing into somebody's base. You could theoretically say that, oh, all shotguns are good for going deep, but not the Ioka. So the Ioka, we're putting it as a good PvE weapon, and the reason I'm not going to put it in PvP is because I don't think you're going to be able to consistently go out and look for people to hunt with an Ioka, especially into late game when they have better gear. If you simply want to camp outside somebody's base or behind a box at a gas station, the Ioka is pretty good. So we're putting the Ioka in PvE. Oh baby, the compound bow. Used to be one of my favorite weapons, and even to this day still has good viability. Right off the bat, I'm gonna say that the compound bow doesn't have that much usability in the early game. And the simple reason for that is there's so many people running around and it has so little durability that by the time you're done killing those 20 nakeds, this thing already needs to be repaired, and the components to repair it are just not available in the early wipe. In the mid wipe, same thing as the hunting bow. It falls off because people have higher caliber weapons, they have larger magazine capacities, and generally lower time to kills. However, if you have a decently sized base in the early game, I will say this weapon is really good at deterring players from knocking down wooden doors. So I'm gonna put this in the rating / counter rating, and for PvP, because generally the damage you get out of it is still pretty good. Oh boy, this piece of this weapon has to be one of the most garbage, one of the most trashed, one of the most spit on weapons in all of Rust ever since the 2022 recoil update. This weapon has always had mid damage. You could shoot somebody who's wearing road sign headgear and still they won't die. And the fact that its fire rate is so damn slow compared to something like the nail gun, which you could also craft at the same tier, doesn't justify carrying this weapon the later you get into a wipe. In the early game, this thing is amazing for killing nakeds. A couple shots to the body and they're down. But as soon as you hit the mid game, where everyone's got a higher time to kill weapon, they're all spewing out more ammunition, and they're all wearing better gear, this weapon just drops off of a cliff. It's not good enough to raid, and it's not good enough to stop a raid because it doesn't have enough damage or ammo capacity. The only time you're going to be using this weapon is to kill nakeds, and you can't really defend a monument or take on something like military tunnels with this weapon consistently. So the only category that I'm going to put this in, and it's purely because it's decent in the early game, is PvP. And ladies and gentlemen, this is the first weapon that's going to be put into the garbage. This is going into the recycling tier. And like I said before, the recycling tier is not just because a weapon in itself is bad, but also because the cost to create that weapon, to craft that weapon, to find the components for that weapon, or to gather the scrap to purchase that weapon are just not worth the effort that it takes to use that weapon. In simpler words, the expense to acquire that weapon is not worth the risk of your life when you could potentially use something else. Again, the reason this is not a tier list is because these weapons do have some use cases. Even the revolver, which I think is probably the worst gun for its cost in the game, has a use case. In the very early game, if you are fighting off hordes of nakeds, the revolver can be an excellent weapon. But anything outside of that use case, it is not worth carrying beyond that area of the wipe. Now, the crossbow. I love the crossbow. I am actually a recent fan of the crossbow. I never used to be a big fan. And the simple reason for that was the fire rate. Of course, we know you have to pull back the string, you have to load up an arrow, and if you miss that one arrow, you have to go through the whole process again and again and again. But as your aim gets better and the more time you spend in the wasteland, you realize that the more skilled you get at primitive PvP, the more viable the crossbow becomes. In the early game, crossbows dominate easily. If you know how to have good movement, if you can strategize your positioning amongst other players, if you can realize that there are going to be multiple people with bows in the early games, you can do some big damage with a crossbow. And into the mid-wipe, you can still do pretty good. Now, the crossbow does fall off in the very late wipe because that's when potentially people had better weapons, but the real downside of using the crossbow in the late game is that it does not do enough damage because most players have good gear. Your one main issue that you're going to have with pretty much any primitive weapon, to be honest, is going to be the fact that the later you go into a wipe, the better armor most people will have. That's the biggest problem with primitive weapons. Now, the crossbow doesn't have a high enough magazine capacity with its one shot and a really long reload time, so it's not going to go in raiding, and it's not good enough to counter raid. It dominates in PvP, especially like I said in the early game. However, most monuments are going to either have players at them, or they're going to have a lot of scientists that are going to just straight up rush you down. So I'm going to say that the crossbow is not viable as a PvE weapon. Alrighty, the flamethrowers. My biggest fear, melting. Look, I'm a bitter ice cream cone that can melt in the sun, so obviously a flamethrower is going to be one of the worst things for me. But in the early wipe, if you can find one of these in some kind of a crate or a box, these things can come in clutch so hard. And this is because most people are still using wooden doors in the first 12 hours of a wipe for the most part. And you can also find players who are still living in their shacks within the first few hours. In the mid-wipe, you almost never see one of these out and about. You're never seeing people raid with flamethrowers, you're never seeing people do PvP with flamethrowers. But in the late wipe, of course, you can use these to burn down high external wood walls, TCs, and spike traps. So in the late game, they get another little bump. But in the very early game, that's where you're going to see the most value from flamethrowers. Obviously, you're not going to use one of these to go PvP with. If you are one of those people who, on wipe day, instead of using your rock to bash in the heads of other nakeds, you're using your torch, alright? If you're using a flamethrower to PvP, you are one of those people. I know it. And keep that shit away from me, because I melt really easily. The flamethrowers are going in raiding, and also counter raiding, to prevent people from pushing through doorways, and PvE because you can also use these on scientists who just like to run mindlessly through the flames. So both of the flamethrowers going in those two categories. Oh yes. Right now we are currently sitting in an official/unofficial shotgun meta. You'll see players in every single stage of the wipe running around with shotguns, whether that's the pipe, whether that's the double barrel. Occasionally you'll see a pumpy or a spaz, but shotguns have gotten such a huge boost since 2022 because practically every shotgun is dead accurate within 100 meters. If you load a slug into any of these shotguns and you aim for the head and you hit, there's a good chance you're walking away with better weapons than you walked in there with. Now, to start off, the pipey. I don't think the pipe is good enough to stop a raid, and I definitely don't think it's good enough to raid somebody with. But for PvP and for PvE, if you consider their use case, right? Again, we're talking about all of the potential use cases for these weapons, meaning we're considering every single ammo type. If you load up a slug into any of these shotguns, all of these shotguns can be used for PvP. However, the only ones I would use for PvE are the pump, the spaz, and the XM4. And out of all of these shotguns, the only ones I would use to raid or counter raid would probably be the spaz and the XM4. The reason I wouldn't put the pumpy in there is not because it doesn't have enough ammo and reserves to not be able to do it. It's because its fire rate is not justifiable enough if you compare it against the spaz and the XM4. So, all of these shotguns are good for PvP, the spaz and the XM4 are raid worthy, and the spaz, the XM4, and the pumpy are good enough for PvP monuments such as Oxum's gas station, military tunnels, or even oil rig. Let me paint you a broader picture of the recycling tier real quick, because I bet you thought this section was over. No. If you were to die and respawn at your base, and you wanted to go out and roam naked with one weapon to possibly recover another kit or to get revenge on your neighbor that was door camping you, could you grab a weapon and go outside of your base with nothing but this weapon? If the answer to that question is no, then it goes into the recycling tier. This is again so we can determine what weapons are worth keeping for their expense cost relative to how reliable they are, solely as you as a solo naked player. Can you trust this weapon with your life if you were naked? And is it worth using whilst naked? Now, in the shotgun section, I would say the answer to that question is yes to every single one of the shotguns except one. And that's the XM4. The reason I'm saying this is because the cost to get the XM4 does not justify you using it as a naked player. Just to put this in perspective, as soon as you respawn as a naked, you could die from a crossbow with one hit to the body. You're instantly down for the most part. So if you were to die and respawn at your base and you had one of these weapons hidden in a box somewhere, would you grab it and take it out as a weapon to possibly defend your life with? And because the XM4 is so expensive to get and it's so expensive to lose, I would say this weapon belongs in the recycling tier. Just like the revolver, especially in the early game, I'm not willing to lose a revolver in the early game as a naked because I wanted to run out naked and try to get a revenge kill or try and secure a kit that I lost. It's just not worth the cost to get the gun in that stage of the game and risk losing it.
Now, the M92 pistol, right?
The M92 pistol is still pretty decent, especially in the early game because of its rate of fire and its magazine capacity. Into mid-wipe, it's still pretty decent because, like I said before, a lot of other players will also be running around with higher tier weapons that have a higher time to kill, have a larger magazine capacity. But as soon as the late game hits, as soon as people start roaming around with AKs, which again, it's not that many, but if you were to run across someone who did have an AK, it is immediately blown out of the water by anyone with a more powerful weapon. It is also a lot less accurate than a lot of late game weapons. If you were to put the M92 pistol up against any other weapon that was a tier 3 weapon, or even some tier 2 weapons, this pistol falls off drastically. However, it does have its use cases. I would say it's an amazing tool for raiding because of its fire rate and its magazine capacity. Let me think about this. Would I use this in PvP? I'm going to be very blunt and honest here, and I'm going to say that no, I wouldn't use this pistol in PvP. And the reason for that is, like I said very early in the beginning, if there's a weapon in the same category of tier or use case that does what it's trying to do better, then it's probably not worth taking. And the semi-auto pistol does what the M39 pistol is trying to do. So I'm gonna say that the M39 pistol is good for raiding, and it's good for PvP because you're going to be taking on multiple NPCs or multiple naked players. But this is one of those weapons where the cost to get it is just so high, and I wouldn't rely on it as a naked because it's just so damn inaccurate. So the M39 pistol, good for raiding, good for counter raiding, it's good for the monuments, but unfortunately it's also going to have to go in the recycle tier just because of how expensive it is to get compared to other weapons that can also do what it's trying to do. So the LMGs prior to 2022 were the perfect weapon that symbolized a synergy between skill level and power. What do I mean by that? The more you practice the recoil pattern for the M249, because that was the gun you were using back then, the more potential damage you could do versus someone who was using potentially an AK. Most guns back then scaled linearly on the progression path, meaning that the harder a weapon was to get, generally also the harder the weapon was to use. But if you could figure out both of those things, if you could acquire the weapon and learn to use it, the reward was equally as great for the most part. And the M249 is no exception to this rule. As long as you learned the recoil pattern, you were beating out pretty much any other player that had anything less than the M249. Now currently, the M249, if you found it in the early game, obviously you're not going to be able to use it because you won't be able to craft the ammo. In the mid game, that's when things start to pick up because you got your tier 2 workbench, you can make your 5.56 ammo, but the late game is where this weapon really shines, especially if you're using it to roof camp. Now I know what you're going to say.
Sorbet, roof camping is toxic. And don't roof camp. Nobody likes a roof camper.
Well, suck the end of my ice cream cone because while you're busy saying that, I'm just gonna be spraying bullets from my roof. Alright, most people right now, they're roof camping. Your neighbor is roof camping. The guy who lives in a fucking shack 300 feet away is also roof camping. Alright, roof camping is everywhere. Don't be ashamed of it. If it works, right? We're no longer in the era of Rust where not roof camping is seen as an honorable thing. Since you no longer have as much control over the recoil patterns of your weapon as you once did, it only makes sense that you attempt to use roof camping when it's viable for you to do so. Alright, don't let these other people tell you, oh, don't roof camp. We're gonna raid you because you're roof camping. It doesn't matter. Let them be sad about it. You just do you. The game no longer incentivizes you to be a hardcore solo survival carry player, and doing so in some instances, especially with the LMGs, is kind of a stupid idea because the cost to go get one of these weapons in terms of their viability, even though they are super good weapons, does not mean you should just be running around by yourself with one of them. However, I will say, because the recoil patterns have been diminished so much, these weapons are practically S tier in every category at the late end of a wipe, and their cost justifies it, so they won't be going into recycling. The minigun, the fucking minigun. Alright, I don't think it needs to be said that the minigun is good for countering raids, and if you're running in a big group, potentially these could be used for raiding. However, you do not want to be running around with one of these, especially as a solo player. Imagine you're running around with road sign gear and a minigun, and you're standing on top of Oxum. So you're dominating all the nakeds, right? Anybody that runs up, dead. Well, somebody who lives nearby pulls out a DB with slugs, double shots you, and you are down. You just lost your minigun to a naked with a double barrel. However, as a solo player, and like most of these weapons on this list, we're referring to you as a solo player. If you are running a monument that has scientists and requires you to take on multiple scientists at once, the minigun is probably one of the best weapons to have, especially if you're trying to speedrun it. If you consider all of the heavies that jump out of one helicopter on an oil rig, this weapon is probably the best weapon for monuments. Now in the early game, of course you're not going to have the ammo to keep up with it, but in the late game, especially on month-long wipe servers, this weapon is probably the best weapon to have when doing tier 3 monuments. So this weapon is going into raiding and counter raiding and the PvE section. This is practically a tool as much as it is a weapon. I've used the grenade launcher multiple times for other use cases that aren't just the HE grenades. This thing can pop out smokes. I'm pretty sure it's got a shotgun shell. This thing does a lot. The early game, you're not gonna have any grenades to go with this unless you're speedrunning tier 3 monuments. In the mid game, however, if you do find some HE grenades, they can be pretty good for taking out anybody who's wearing road sign or less. Alright? Especially if you're just camping at a monument, you can just drop people. However, I wouldn't use it for PvP around this time unless you're really transitioning into the later wipe. Now, where this thing comes in really handy, where this thing really shines is raiding. That's because anytime you blow down a door or bust open a wall, you just pop a couple HE grenades in there and anyone who's in that room is instantly dead. You can also load up some smoke grenades into this thing and block off lines of sight from trees, from hills, from opposing bases. This thing is amazing for raids. So obviously, it's going in there. PvP, I wouldn't recommend it. However, I wouldn't say that it's a dumb idea to use it, but I'm not gonna put it there. And for monuments, I really can't see anybody using this intentionally at a monument, whether that's a tier 3 monument or even just recycling at Oxums, because it's such a valuable weapon slash tool to have. So this is going in just the raiding slash counter raiding category. You've got a nail gun. I've got a nail gun. Your mom's got a fucking nail gun. Alright. The nail gun is probably the most used weapon that I've seen across every hour of the wipe. Whether you kill a naked, whether you kill someone who's got a wolf head headdress, whether you kill someone who's wearing road sign, it seems like everyone and their mom is carrying around a fucking nail gun in their purse. And I don't blame them. This is probably the most effective weapon per its cost in all areas of the wipes. Now, it does get beaten out, of course, during the mid-wipe because there are players who have a higher magazine capacity, a lower time to kill. In the later wipe, of course, you've got players who have more long-range weapons, but there will still be players who don't move past tier 1 or intentionally don't roam with anything greater than tier 1 weapons, therefore making the nail gun more viable in today's meta than it was prior to the 2022 aim cone introduction. But a nail gun as a sidearm for pretty much any other weapon is always a good idea, especially in the early game. You can raid with it in the early game, you can PvP with it in the early, mid, and late game, and sometimes, if you are one of those people who also run around with the flamethrowers like a maniac, you could probably try killing scientists with these nail guns, because the nails are so cheap to make. Alright, I've done it before, and it is quite dangerous, but it does save on resources quite a bit. And if you go to any populated Oxum's gas station or abandoned supermarket, you're bound to find people running around with nail guns. So they're fantastic for those monuments. So the nail gun is going in all 3 tiers, baby. All right, before this gun was added, the gun that took its place was the M92 pistol. And of course, I'm talking about the Prototype 17. The Prototype 17 is fantastic in the mid-game if you're trying to go up against anyone that has a higher time to kill weapon with a larger magazine capacity. It's great for quickly taking people out. It's got a large magazine capacity so you could take on multiple people. And like I said before, it's basically the upgraded M92 pistol from the past. Back in Legacy Rust, the M9 pistol was the go-to pistol if you wanted to spray and pray at anybody. It had controllable recoil, fast fire rate, high magazine capacity. This thing was downing people left and right. Now, not so much, as we've already discussed, but the Prototype 17 has come and it's taken its place, and it's good for practically everything, so it's going in all 3 categories. This right here, boy, used to be my sand piece. Alright, we're talking about the Python. This used to be my go-to weapon prior to 2022 if I was roaming solo and I wanted to take medium to low risk based on what resources I had at the time. This weapon, for the most part, if you could land 2 headshots, killed pretty much anybody. But now, with the recent additions to the game and the aim cone that has affected pretty much every single gun, this gun, I honestly don't know where it lies on terms of a tier list, because it's not as good as the high caliber, but it's not as trash as the regular revolver. It lies more towards the trash tier with the regular revolver, but again, it does have its very niche use cases. I would say this thing belongs in the PvP section, and it belongs in the recycling section. Alright, clean up on aisle 11. Somebody dropped a Python. This weapon is going in the garbage. And that's mostly because it is so expensive to craft one of these in terms of components. You might as well save those parts for a different weapon. The amount of damage this thing does, the aim cone that's been added into the game, it's just not worth carrying a Python around as a sidearm, especially if you could craft any other sidearm. In the early game, sure, you know, kill some nakeds, kill some hazzies, and if you're really fucking good, you could probably drop some people wearing road sign. But in terms of consistency, you are not going to be wanting to rely on this weapon to carry you into the late game. So this piece of trash is going in PvP and the recycling tier. Alright, on the opposite end of things, the better looking brother, the champion of all ages, hitting with a force of a 9mm with an effective reach of about 200 meters, the semi-auto pistol. Alright, the semi-auto pistol is the top tier. I would say, again, if this was a tier list of Rust weapons today, the semi-auto pistol easily goes in the S tier. And that's because you can use it for everything, and the cost to its efficiency is perfect, right? It's one semi-auto body, it's a little bit of high quality metal, some metal fragments, and you are rocking and rolling. The recoil on this thing is damn near 0, and you've got a 10 round magazine capacity, which should be more than enough to take on a couple people at once. And the aim cone, honestly, is not that bad. It is not that bad. For the use case you're trying to fill with this weapon, it is perfect. Out of all of the weapons, and you can put this on the record, Sorbet said this, 2024, the semi-auto pistol has the best aim cone for that weapon's use case. It's good enough to raid somebody in the early to mid game. PvP, you can take this through every stage in the early, mid, and late game of PvP and be just fine. I would very gladly trust this weapon with my life running out of my base as a naked. It can take on monuments, everything from abandoned supermarket to Oxum's gas station to the dome. You can even use this on oil rig. Although it may take some time, the ammo cost, the magazine size is good enough to do practically everything in the game. So without a doubt, the semi-auto pistol is going in every category, and if this was a tier list, this would easily be an S tier weapon. Alright, this is a god tier weapon. It's high noon. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, we are talking about the high caliber revolver. This is what you think of whenever you think of a revolver. You think high damage, you think high accuracy, and you think of long ranges, right? You think 2-shot headshots, you think 3-shot body shots. This is an S tier weapon. However, this weapon is pretty expensive to craft. At the time of making this list, I'm pretty sure it's a gear and it's a couple pipes, and maybe even a spring, alright? This weapon does not play around in terms of expense. But, and I hate to say this, I really hate to say this weapon is not good because it's a good weapon. This weapon is good because it's better than the other options. Let me explain. The revolver is a piece of garbage because it doesn't do enough damage. The python is not good enough because it doesn't do enough damage, and it's expensive to craft. The high caliber revolver is obviously better than those two weapons, but because it costs so much to craft, I would not put this as an S tier weapon. I would probably put this as an A tier weapon. All right, this weapon is solving the gaps that Face Punch has implemented, right? They're giving you the medication to the disease that they created. They created this in the Cobalt lab somewhere, and they're gonna force you to take it. This gun solves the issues that the game creates, but that does not necessarily mean it's a great weapon. All right, I pray to the ice cream lords that we do not end up at a situation where every gun in Rust has 3 components on top of high quality metal and metal fragments to craft just to have a viable weapon to use in the game. One that's accurate, one that does enough damage, one that has a good magazine capacity, and one that has a decent fire rate. I pray that we don't get to that point where we are farming multiple components for weapons. I hope this is not the beginning to something disastrous. Now, you can use the high caliber revolver for counter raiding because it's so accurate. Probably wouldn't want to raid with it because, you know, fire rate and magazine capacity is not that good. PvP, obviously, it's what it was made for. And PvE is a little tricky because whilst you can kill people if your aim is good enough, the fact that aim cone still exists in the game and it affects pretty much every single weapon, I don't think I'm gonna put it in PvE, because in PvE, although it's good to have good damage, you do want to have a larger magazine capacity. Now, you don't need to have the best fire rate, but a good magazine capacity is appreciated. So I'm gonna put this thing in raiding and counter raiding, mostly because you can counter raid with it, and in the PvP section because, come on, it's high noon.
Sorbet, you don't like this? You don't like your assault rifle? Fucking, it's a good weapon. It's a good weapon. It's still a cost a lot, but still, it's still accurate. You can still use it. You still people going.
I can already see the salt from the salty caramel rolling in right now. All right, I can already see the stacks of notes that Toasty and I are gonna be reading later about this weapon. The most controversial weapon in the game since 2022, the AK/assault rifle. Now, let me start with where this weapon is good. In the early game, unless you've got a group, this weapon is probably not going to be something you're running around with, because you're going to get shot by someone with a DB and you're going to be mad. You also can't make the ammo until you get a tier 2 workbench, so unfortunately you probably won't be roaming with this until the mid game. Now, if you are in the mid game, this weapon easily wipes out 90% of the weapons that most people are using, but in the late game, you are still going to find that players are running around with double barrel slugs, with high caliber revolvers, with Tommy guns, and if you play long enough, at some point, somebody's gonna kill you with a lesser weapon. It's going to happen. This is not an if. This is a when. If you take one assault rifle out of your base and you try to run the durability of that weapon all the way down to 0, to the point where you want to repair it in the late game, you will more than likely come across someone who is going to kill you with that weapon before it hits 0 durability. I can almost guarantee it. And that's because players are intentionally running around with lower tier weapons because the cost to create weapons now and their effectiveness because of the aim cone has been reduced so much that there's almost no point to going out with anything greater than tier 2 or even tier 1 weapons. It will happen. I guarantee it. So I'm going to put this in the recycling category, but it still does have its use cases. You can raid with it, you can counter raid with it, you can PvP with it, and you can do PvE with it. But this is the whole reason why I didn't make a tier list, and that's because there are other weapons that can do what the AK can do with less of an expense on your resources, whether that be early, mid, or late game. If you're raiding or counter raiding, if you're going to be using a high tier weapon, you might as well use the M2, because instead of losing the time it would have taken to get the rifle body, to get all of the high quality metal that it takes to create the AK, to get all the components, to get all the metal, you might as well just go with the M2. If you're gonna PvP, you might as well just use a Tommy gun, because you're not going to be shooting people from extreme ranges anymore, and the time to kill on close range is mostly dependent on the strategy someone is using to engage another person with, okay? Most people are not going out with AKs just spraying at 600 meters because they practice the recoil patterns, all right? Most people are using Tommies, they're using SARs, and they're engaging you within 100 to maybe 250, maybe even 300 meters. And because the recoil patterns have been brought down to an almost minuscule, non-existent level, there are other weapons that can still have a high time to kill with a good strategy that can take out somebody who's also using an AK. So the use case of running around with an AK has diminished in value simply because of the fact that every gun's recoil is basically on an even playing field now. So whilst I put this gun in every category, it is also garbage because of how much it costs to acquire this weapon. Remember, this is not my opinion, this is a fact. Now, the LR. You know it, I know it, everybody knows it. The LR used to be the stepping stool to those who did not want to practice the recoil pattern of the AK but still wanted to be on a level playing field. The LR was the perfect weapon. Again, you guys know how I feel about the aim cone and how ridiculous it was for the game because it's changed so much. But the LR used to be the weapon that if you didn't want to practice the AK recoil pattern, you could still pick up the LR and you didn't even have to craft it. You could go to Bandit and buy this for scrap. Within a couple hours of farming scrap, you could have an assault rifle that rivaled people who spent 6 hours trying to get the AK, and things were good. Things were amazing. Now, just like the AK, the LR still does have its use case, and it's going in all three of the main categories, but where I'm not gonna put it, I'm not going to put it in the recycling, because the cost of scrap, if you were to look at in terms of time, how fast can you craft an AK versus how fast can you acquire an LR is much lower on an LR. So the expense to acquire the LR and the value that it provides is pretty damn nice compared to the AK. All right, you're not running out of your base naked with an AK. You're just not. You're not going to rely on it because it's taken, you know, a couple hours to get the high quality metal. It might have taken you 30 minutes to 45 minutes to get the necessary tools, gear, and resources to go find an assault rifle body. And of course, you had to craft it if you didn't find it. So the LR is actually, I would say, an even better value in terms of effectiveness compared to the assault rifle. So it's going in all three main categories. All right, this is possibly my favorite weapon in all of Rust of all time. Some of you might have thought it was actually the AK because I go on so much about how the recoil patterns, yada, yada, yada. No, my favorite weapon is actually the bolt action rifle. All right, I love sniping in games. I freaking love it. You guys know me, I am the coldest mother effing ice cream cone to have ever touched the wasteland, and I love dropping people from long ranges. Now, in the early game, this weapon is not so good because you just can't craft the ammo for it, and you can't get a scope for it unless you buy it. But as soon as mid-game hits, as soon as you've got the ability to make the ammo and get a good scope, this thing is dropping everybody. And that's because if you can hit a headshot on anybody, there's pretty much nobody that can withstand a headshot from a bolty, even at the longest ranges that you'll be shooting them from. Now, into the late game, you may want to refine your strategy. You may not want to go to the lower tier monuments, simply due to the fact that you may lose the gun to somebody who's got lesser weapons than you, but it's still a powerful weapon. Obviously, this thing is good for counter raiding. It's great for PvP in the mid game, and it's also decent for monuments in the late game. So the bolty is going in all three main categories. The L96, just like the bolty, I love this weapon. However, purely due to its cost to maintain and the risk of losing it earlier in the wipe, you really only want to be using this weapon in the late game, and mostly on the defensive side, right? You mostly only want to be using this to counter raid, to roof camp, to sit on top of a monument. I would not recommend roaming with an L96 unless you're in a big group. Although you can, I would not recommend it because of how expensive the weapon is. But just like the bolty, this gun is going in all three main categories. All right, things are gonna get weird here for a little moment, okay? Things are gonna get a little cringe. Things are gonna get a little awkward. The M39 rifle and practically every other military grade weapon besides the LR has become unrecognizable from what it once was prior to the aim cone introduction. Right before aim cone, the military weapons were the most accurate compared to their handmade counterparts, except for the LR, I believe. I believe the LR was still slightly more inaccurate than the AK, or maybe it did less damage. I know it did less damage, but Either way, generally, the military weapons of right now are slightly worse, in my opinion, in terms of accuracy compared to their handmade counterparts. In the early game, this weapon is practically useless because you're not going to be crafting the ammo to be able to use it long enough. But in the mid game, these things are going to be taking out practically everybody who's got a higher time to kill weapon. And I believe the M92 pistol was exactly the same way, where you could carry a military grade weapon of a lesser subcategory, meaning that you could be carrying the M92 pistol and go against somebody with, say, like a Tommy or a SAR, and you could drop people. You could drop people just fine in the mid game. That's mostly because players don't have a good enough gear to be able to withstand these weapons and their intense fire rates or damage output. But as soon as you hit the late game, the M39 rifle just becomes a little bit obsolete. And the reason I say that, the reason I trash on the military weapons is because if they're only going to be slightly more damaging and we have to deal with the fact that they are not as accurate as they used to be, I can't see myself relying on this weapon to protect my life. Whilst you can roam with this thing mid-game, I would not recommend it for anything else except PvP and maybe raiding or counter raiding, right? You can use this thing to kill scientists. You can use it to kill people over at Oxum's gas station. You can use it to defend the dome, right? You can use this thing in a counter raiding situation, but I would not recommend it over other options, although it is slightly good enough to perform those actions. So the M39 rifle, kind of like the M92 pistol, has its use cases, but it's also going in the garbage tier just because of how expensive it is to get versus how efficient it is to use. Now, the SAR. This is the dearly beloved of most players prior to 2022. All right, if you didn't have an AK, you were running around with a SAR, baby. This was your sharpshooter. This was your head taker. This was your executioner's sword, okay? You were dropping people with the SAR back then. Obviously, in the early game, not really gonna have much of a use because you're not gonna be making the ammo for it, but as soon as you get a tier 2 workbench going, this thing is a rocket ship. Now, I will say it's not as much of a rocket ship as it used to be, and that really shows itself as soon as you get into the late game. As soon as people start running around with higher tier weapons, and I'll even say this is mostly in the mid to late game, when groups are running around with AKs, this gun just slowly starts to lose its edge. And once you get into hyper late game, this thing does not stand up to most weapons because it's so damn inaccurate most of the times. The times when you really need to be accurate and you need to go against multiple people with good gear, you are not taking the SAR for the most part. Now, I'm not gonna say you can't. Just like the M39, I'm not gonna say you can't do something with this weapon, but I'm going to say, on the record, there are weapons that you could better invest your time and resources into that aren't the SAR. If you want to go PvP, maybe you could take a high caliber revolver. If you want to go to PvE with monuments, you could probably take a custom SMG, you could probably take a Tommy, heck, you could even take a Spaz with slugs. But because the main superpower of the SAR has been taken away, which was its accuracy, has been diminished so much, its use case is now more general. It's not just a PvP weapon. I'm also gonna say, and this is going to stir a lot of people's fudge, I don't think the SAR is good enough to use as a raiding weapon. As a counter raiding weapon, maybe, especially in the mid game, if someone's raiding you with custom SMGs, shotguns, Tommies, or other SARs, maybe. But I don't think its fire rate is good enough, and I don't think its damage is good enough to be used as a raiding tool. So I'm going to put it in raiding and counter raiding because in the early to mid game, it's good for countering raids, and I'll put it in PvE because you can still use this thing to kill scientists that are rushing you down, because most of the time, whether you're going to Oxum's gas station or you're dealing with a bunch of scientists, the players and the NPCs are generally running at you. In PvE, what I'm thinking is that mostly you are running after players. And I do not recommend you chasing people with a SAR, because if they lead you to a group of players who also have SARs or who have weapons that can put down more heat downrange, you are going to lose, without a doubt. So it's good on the defensive side for counter raiding, and it's good enough to defend monuments and push scientists. So it's going in those two categories, but I'm also going to put it in recycling. And the reason I'm going to do that is because I feel like if you put your resources into building a SAR and you lose it, I'd be willing to bet the last of my sprinkles that if you had put that semi-body into a semi-auto pistol rather than a SAR, you probably could have done better with that semi-auto pistol and lost less resources in terms of the ammo cost and the gun cost than building the SAR and losing the cost of the gun and its ammo cost. So the SAR is also going in the garbage tier. Now again, if you're one of those lunatics that are running around on the beach with a torch, you're gonna think that the rocket launcher is a PvP weapon, but let's be honest, this thing is used for raiding and counter raiding. and not much more. You know what? I'm also going to put it in the PvE section because you could use it on NPCs like the attack helicopter and the big scientist. So you know what? Why not? All right, the custom. The little gun. The custom is pretty much good in every single stage of the wipe, especially into the late game, because again, most players now are only running around with tier 1 and maybe tier 2 weapons. So the value of a lower tier weapon is actually higher than late game weapons. Obviously, you can use this thing to pepper down nakeds, multiple people in groups. It's good for monuments. It's good for pretty much everything. I'm gonna put this in every category. All right, the MP5. The MP5 is good. Without a doubt, it's good. Without a doubt, it can do pretty much everything. Although I will teeter on the edge that it might be kind of garbage tier just because it costs so much scrap to get. But the fact that you can craft one of these and you can repair one of these is so good, I'm not gonna put it in recycling tier. All right. The cherry on top we've all been waiting for. You saw this coming. I saw this coming. If this was a tier list, this weapon would absolutely be S tier. We're talking about the Tommy gun. This gun only has 20 rounds, but I would say that is a glass half full of looking at this weapon. When I see the Tommy gun, I say, the Tommy gun has 20 rounds? And the reason I say that is because that is pretty much all you need to get pretty much anything done in the game. Whether you're killing a heavy scientist, whether you're PvPing with someone in full plate gear, or whether you're taking out hordes and hordes of nakeds with spears who keep killing you at Oxum's gas station while you're recycling, the Tommy gun does it all. It has all of the necessary attachments that you could possibly need. You can extend the mag, you can put a silencer on it, you can put a hollow sight on it, you can put a flashlight and a laser on it. The Tommy gun is without a doubt probably the best weapon in the game in terms of its efficiency and its value for what it provides you in its specific use cases next to the semi-auto pistol. Alright, the semi-auto pistol has huge value, almost as much as the Tommy, and the Tommy gun is only slightly better because it has more ammo and a faster fire rate. Now, in the early game, it does suffer just a little bit because you can die to people who do make double barrels, and like I said, like to kill you at Oxum's gas station. But if you can avoid situations like that, the Tommy gun is pretty much good for everything. And for the most part, the Tommy gun's always been like that. The Tommy gun has been that weapon that you could rely on no matter what you were doing. Now, because of the aim cone, it's not as good as it used to be prior to 2022, but that goes for most weapons on this list. And obviously, we're putting this thing in every category except recycling because it's such a good value. It's such a good gun. It deserves it. All right. Remember, these are the facts, okay? This is not an opinion. This is where these weapons belong. And if you don't like it, suck the tip of my ice cream cone. Now, there's a couple weapons that aren't here on the list, that being the Tier 1 SMG / the handmade SMG and the SKS. There's a couple reasons I didn't include them on this list, and that's because I couldn't find the PNG for them, but also because I'm going to be describing something that is affecting Rust that not a lot of people are talking about in a later video. You've heard of it, I've heard of it. It's called power creep. Yes, power creep has made its way into Rust. The things they are adding now, seemingly, are better than what already exists in the game, and for some reason, they come with DLC skins, gesture packs, and Twitch drops. Could this be part of the conspiracy that we've all been talking about? How Rust might be monetizing in very sneaky ways? Who knows? But I'll be talking about that in a future video. And finishing this list, I never thought we'd get to the point where guns in a survival shooter game actually had aim cone. I didn't think we were gonna have to decide whether an assault rifle was worth carrying over an SMG. But alas, here we are. It's fucking ridiculous that we have 3 revolvers that are trying to achieve the same goal but are completely different at the same time. One of which does no damage, one that can kill anyone with 2 headshots, and one that looks like it's the best option from an aesthetics standpoint, but actually doesn't really have a use case anymore because of how expensive it is. Speaking of expensive, military weapons are not worth the purchase because the scrap could be better spent on upgrading a workbench or learning the tech tree. Also, most somewhat viable weapons don't even require you to play the game in the way it was meant to be played. You can just craft everything inside your base with scrap and components. And because of that, almost no one is willing to roam with weapons past tier 1. Because why the f would you? Just grab a trusty old double barrel shotgun, pop some slugs in there, and get hunting. I'm sure you'll find some solo idiot running around with a SAR or Tommy. Keep yourself safe out there on the wasteland, everyone, and choose your gun wisely. Stay frosty.